ثانية وانفجارات كبيرة وهائلة، وربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
All right. Hello. Welcome to Varn Blog. And today we have longtime friend of the show and general malcontent, my partner in crime off and on for these 4 years, J.G. Michael.
And listening to you for even longer than 4 years. I've been listening since I was in my teens.
That is creepy. Do not say things like that. Because you're what, almost like 30, right?
Yep, just turned 30 this past April.
Yeah, I've been doing this for a long time.
Well, I'm just saying it because diet soap and like your commentaries on diet soap were actually pretty influential to me. Got me thinking about things differently. They were helpful.
Yeah. So my threats to run back to North Africa have should not be heeded, I suppose. So how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. Just trying to stay inside because out here in Pittsburgh, it is cold, it is freezing, and it's snowing way too often. So
it snowed here this morning, but it warmed up. Weather's been strange out here in Utah. It's been both too cold and too warm in rapid succession.
Mhm.
But I'm sure people are coming in to hear climate change talk, right? Those of you who are interested in that should tune in. We'll be doing a special diving into the wreckage this weekend with Sean KB of Antifada on nothing but climate depressing news. But this is not the time to plug. Also, I'm staying inside because I'm a little wary. We just had the legislature, which passed special rules about the ability to run mass mandates, undo their own rules because we had to mass mandate during Omicron and the rural districts could not abide.
I was going to say right now with COVID, the sense I'm getting from a lot of people, even outside of the circles we run in is, especially amongst a lot of the parents I know, everyone just feels like everything is mixed signals. They don't know what to do. In some ways, it feels, maybe you'll disagree with me, but in some ways, things feel worse than at the beginning of the pandemic.
Oh, yeah, they're way worse.
Everyone just seems completely confused. Parents don't know what to do with their kids if their kids have it. And, it's insane.
Well, they've been sending mixed messages. And, I mean, our schools have been shutting down just from... not because we haven't closed the schools since the first 4 months, but our schools have been shutting down recently just because there's no one to staff them. That we had 40 to 50% of staff and 40% of kids on isolation. Now isolation is only 5 days, so they went virtual for a 3-day week this week because it was a short week in my district, and. We got our N95 mask, but they are going to go back in without masks on Monday. We'll see what that leads to. We already are one of the top 5 infectious states. There's also talk here of pulling a Florida, which for those of you who don't know what that means, pulling a Florida is when you undertest and claim to have the best rates in the country until you hit max hospital capacity about 3 weeks later. and thus can't deny it anymore. They are slowing down access to testing here, and the general health guidelines here is if you have COVID, stay home. They don't want you testing. So that's where we're at. But the messaging from the Democrats has been all over the place. I mean, both in the news and from Biden. 1 minute it's a plague of the unvaccinated, even when it's Omicron. The next minute it's only Delta killing people, and it's still Delta that led to the uptick in deaths in the beginning of the year. Then it's Omicron, but only for the unvaxxed. They keep on running articles from the CDC implying that Omicron's about to go endemic, but the WHO is saying that because of the lack of global vaccines, and the WHO's answer to this is also somewhat funny. We would have to talk about this a little bit. The WHO has a point that there's been a hoarding of vaccines, particularly with the pushing out of boosters. The boosters actually are super effective, and it's very weird to ask states that have the resources not to use them. But there is some concern of over boosting, so of accelerating the booster shots too fast, not giving them, not putting them on an annual basis, and over boosting the population, that's leading to a weird immune response. So there's a lot of variability. The one thing I think is totally legitimate, though, that the WHO's saying is that if we don't get the developed world vaccinated to at least like 60-70% capacity, it's a breeding ground for new variants that will breach the vaccine. So we're just going to get back into this cycle like every year and be overwhelmed. Because nobody thinks COVID's going away now. I don't know if anybody ever really did who was serious. But here we are. The heavy investment in Africa has been in the China vaccine, which is also not Omicron effective at all, apparently. So they're afraid of a pushback of vaccines in the developing world because they got them with the development of Omicron, which the vaccines were not made for, and thus the vaccines don't work. And if you think about trying to communicate something that complicated to people who are not epidemiologically literate, you can see what the problems are going to be, similar to like miscommunication in Africa during the AIDS crisis, which was a total public health failure. That wasn't because Africa's, but I'm going to stop saying underdeveloped. I'm going to start saying overexploited. But it wasn't just because of that. It was also because the programs and whatnot were implemented so late, the spread was so vast, and they were largely discredited by that time. Plus, the drugs were super expensive. So yeah, on all levels, and it's not just been in the U.S. This is one thing I'm going to give you, but people in the U.S. think we're uniquely bad at this. We might be compared to China, although it's hard to know what's actually going on in China. They're doing no matter if they're fixing their numbers or not, they're doing better than us. But it's hard to know what's actually going on in China in regards to Omicron. What we can say for sure is that Europe is only faring marginally better than us. Canada's running out of tests too, and no one knows anybody's real case numbers. Like, we don't really know how many people have Omicron because a lot of the places have run out of PRC tests. They've been hoarded up by like tech industry people and whatnot. And we're using antigen spit tests, which A, have false positives a lot of the time, but B, people don't have to report them. So who knows what the actual infection rate really is. And I don't say that to like get people all excited. Omicron, for the vast majority of individuals, is far less dangerous than everything else, but it's so virulent that it's still probably going to kill as many people as it's probably still going to kill more people than Delta. I mean, even the CDC was releasing a study that said that we might hit 1 million dead by March. Okay, so that's all the COVID bad news. The thing about this, though, is politicization has gotten far worse around COVID, and no one can say that either side doesn't have a political response to this. I mean, trust the science when you're not really explaining the science and it seems to change every 5 minutes is a terrible slogan, and liberals really need to grow up about it.
Yeah,
JG, what do you
I would
think?
agree with that. I mean, I've always found it weird, the whole just the way we've turned everything into like these slogans, pithy slogans, you know, whether it's trust the science or I love science or support the troops, or it's just all, it boils things down into like an absurd reductionism. And I don't know what to make of it other than I guess it's expedient. It's easier to just say trust the science rather than to like explain the science. I think it's, I mean, I go back to this too much. I'm too much like Thomas Frank maybe in this regard, but to me, I always say, you know, if there's an issue with people not trusting the science, maybe that's indicative that we're not educating people correctly.
Oh,
It's
we're
a sign
totally
of
not.
technocratic failure, in my opinion, or elite failure.
People are telling me about slogans being good in the chat.
I'm sorry if I offended anyone.
Yeah, I don't care. I will say slogans are only good if they are for something that is actually useful to be sloganized. Most things aren't. So here we are.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I would say, I mean, trust the science would have made sense until the CDC did the 5-day rule, which was done pretty much because employers were pressuring governors, and governors called Biden, at least according to a couple of different people I know who work in epidemiology, and some people I know who work in just healthcare, including my own brother. Now I don't know how they know that. That might be a rumor that's just going around, but it does seem totally like that decision was politically motivated. Nobody I know, including conservative science, like conservative political scientists, have been able to, give me any evidence that there was any good sound evidence for a 5-day quarantine and for stuff like, I mean, we had a school here that said asymptomatic test positives could come back for a while because of the number of false positives with the antigen test. But people were like, well, you're going to spread it like haywire. So no one knows what's going on. There's also kind of something going on in conservative world that the teachers don't want to come in, but most of the teachers I know hate dealing with online education. It's literally, I don't mind it. It's literally my job. But I also work in a system where like the people who come to me are volunteers. They have chosen this program. It is not a charter school program. It is a fully public school program before people get any ideas out there. I've done charter school work in the past. It's not that. But this is a voluntary experimental program by my district. Where we have said for people who do not feel safe coming into the schools that we will provide them a high quality online education for any reason. All right. So they cannot feel safe for anxiety reasons and use this. The feedback on it has been largely good, but I can tell you that the stats also indicate that it's not super effective for low income, low motivation students. All right. Because low income, low motivation students generally, if they succeed in school, do so off of peer-to-peer or mentor to student relationships, not out of self-motivation most of the time. That's not, you can't generalize to each individual. So we should always keep that the aggregate and the individual are separate. But so the students who are most successful in my program would be successful in school anyway. That is not 100% true. But that is largely true, and we've known this for a long time. And I've been talking a lot, JG, but this is just to get us into the particular moment, and this is a very dated podcast. So when this goes out in 2 weeks, who knows what have happened between now and then? But what do you make of the Democrats' complete botching of the messaging here?
I mean, I'm not really that surprised by it. I just, it is a really despairing time in my view. I mean, we're at a moment where I think, the left is in a great deal of trouble. Progressives, who I wouldn't say are the same as, the left.
Whatever the left TM means at this point.
Well, they're just, the progressives are not doing very well at all.
No.
And you're seeing all of it in the news. And I don't think it's simply, the capitalist media is attacking the agenda. It's much more, I would say, deeply rooted.
Writing off bourgeois media because you don't like what it says is a perfect confirmation bias mechanism, right? Like you can do that for anything. And also, what isn't bourgeois media in our society? I guess maybe like, I'm going to believe Chinese state media. Well, they're reporting a lot of the same things, so I don't know what you got. What I would say, JG, is progressives are screwed. But that I looked at that Pew poll in detail, the most recent one. And there's a couple polls that show that a lot of independents have gone from leaning Democrat to leaning Republican, and there's been an uptick in Republican affiliation amongst the young. It fits my thesis that there's not a whole lot of people who still have a lot of inheritance coming to them, but those in their late 30s, just slightly younger than me, are getting a lot of their inheritance early, probably because their parents are afraid. So who knows what you're going to do with that? And I think that has a conservatizing factor. I think the progressives have looked, and it's not just the propaganda, propaganda of someone like Jimmy Dore, whatever you think of him. And I think it's pretty clear where his bread is ultimately buttered. I know that someone's going to scream ad hominem at me, but it's actually directly relevant when one's taking contradictory positions on the vaccine than one even took.
I was just gonna add to that. I know where at least a few of his latest guests have had their bread buttered. I mean, I know he just had RFK Jr. on, and that was horrifying, just because there's a lot of people that are profiteering and grifting off this pandemic. I mean, I think RFK Jr.'s group, and he's been anti-vax for longer than people want to admit.
He's been anti-vax for at least 15 years. Like even back when he was on Air America Radio, he was an anti-vaxxer.
Yeah, I'm blanking on the name of his anti-vax organization. Oh, it's the Children's Defense Fund. It used to be the World Mercury something or other. But I found out recently, since the pandemic started, that Children's Defense Fund that he runs, it's made $6.6 million in the course of a year. And yet, when you say this to some of the people who are very uncritical of Jimmy Dore or Jimmy Dore's guests, it's like, well, you're defending the system and the real profiteers. The money is being pushed upward. The billionaire class during the pandemic, which I don't actually disagree.
Actually, but a lot of these people are also in the next adjacent class, right?
Yes.
These are not workers talking to you about workerism, and if anyone tries to pitch it to you, they're selling you something. Be they somebody pretending to be a leftist or not. I get why. I don't say this because there are people who've taken stands that I may agree or disagree with, that I think are consistent with leftist principles that can seem anti-vaccine. For example, Richard Wolff, the Marxist economist. I'm using that term loosely, the Marxist part, not the economist part. He's definitely an economist. Highly influenced by Althusser, but it's been greatly riding this wave of like popular frontism with all forms of the left, and has been pushing against vaccine mandates because of worker opinion. Well, worker opinion actually in vaccine mandates is all over the place. It highly depends on the section of the economy you're looking at. Some unions have pushed back against vaccine mandates. Some have pushed for them. But I would even say, my personal opinion on vaccine mandates is the payoff for the effect, for the backlash that they generate, never made a lot of sense to me. Because even the prediction was it would only lead to about 5% to 10% more vaccinated people, considering who it actually affected. And that was totally the most optimistic view of what it would affect. And most studies have indicated the backlash is really bad, and it's led to a lot of it's led to the undoing of a lot of legal precedent, because the Democrats have not taken care of the courts in the same way the GOP did. The Democrats do not seem to have either a judicial or local strategy outside of the cities. Now, as people on the left, that should only concern us because a big faction of the left has made common cause with the Democrats. And what's interesting is when you look at that Pew poll that I mentioned earlier, right? Break it down. There's this weird category that they put in the center of when they broke up their chart. They talked about the outsider left, and those questions are broad enough that you and I might actually be considered. Now, I didn't take any Pew poll. No one has polled me, but you and I might actually be considered part of the outsider left, even though we would normally think we're not on the spectrum at all. So it's hard to know what our relationship is to the progressive decline, but the progressive decline has been significant. The other thing that people need to pay attention to, people keep on thinking that there's been a growth of far-right politics in America. Far-right politics in America has just been fairly steady. It's just more brazen. What is happening right now, from all the stats I see, is those suburban men who became Democrats during the end of the Trump administration are going back to being Republicans, and Latino and Asian non-graduate degree holders are going back to their pre-2006 position of being Republican. Slowly. It has not happened overnight. It's still overwhelmingly the Republicans are still overwhelmingly right. Although I was listening to the 538 interview, and people keep on laughing at me mentioning 538, but I was mentioning 538 interview these people who were worried about civil war, and 538 was pointing out that the GOP's percentage of non-white voters has actually gone up every cycle since 2012, and that the reason for the marginal change now is actually a whole lot of people of color, particularly Latinos, and the disidentification of people who priorly identified as Latino, as non-white, as white. So it's interesting that we see this, and I hate personally that we leave all the polling and everything to these centrist organizations. But right now, if I'm reading the news, I hate to tell you people, but if you got to choose between 538 and Jacobin, you choose 538. Jacobin's blowing smoke up its own butt. What do you think, JG? I've been talking for a lot.
I won't comment on Jacobin. I like some of their stuff, but I get where you're coming from in so much as I think that, and this is interesting, I've always sort of taken Noam Chomsky's position on reading mainstream news media, which it's not like don't read New York Times, or don't read the Post, or don't read
the
538. That's never what he has sort of advocated for. He's saying you have to read it critically and read between the lines. And a lot of times if you read the news and realize that there's agendas because of corporate ownership and whatnot, you can sort of figure out what's going on and where the spin's happening. But I think a lot of people have adopted this idea of, well, no, I can just listen to this alt media figure, and it's ultimately led to, I think, an interesting phenomena where, we used to have like combat TV that sort of really gained national prominence in the 80s with people like Morton Downey Jr., right? And I mean, it goes back further than that. I think a lot of it starts with the Vidal-Buckley debate. Then it goes, even bigger when Bill O'Reilly gets on air. But really, we see that in, progressive media and so-called alt media now, I think there's a whole YouTube channel devoted to debates where they fight over a fake championship belt now. I was told that recently by one of our mutual friends, and I was just absolutely horrified. But really, I look at a lot of the alt media landscape, and for the most part, it seems like it's pro wrestling ultimately.
Well,
I
that's
really,
cheaper.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, you and I. Okay, now I'm not going to ask you to out anybody here, but let's be frank about what we know. We know that a whole lot of people we knew who entered journalism have either had to work for foreign state outlets to get paid, or had to pimp themselves out the stuff like Substack. We also know that if we look at the alt media, increasingly their credentials are the same as any other media credentials. They were minor advisors to political campaigns, who with Ivy League degrees, who now have shows. They come from, even if they're of color, a lot of them come from what we might call the hot bourgeoisie of color, which is the old money of a people of color. They, which have been contained in more contained media spheres in the past. And so on one hand, that's a sign of progress, but on another hand, it's totally a delusive sign of progress in that it doesn't really mean that a whole lot more people are actually being represented by this change. And just go back and look at the number of huge podcasters who still come out of New York and LA and of Ivy League schools. And that's alt media. Those are, look at the amount of alt media created by, I'm going to name a name here, TYT, which is got its whole internal infrastructure of both, turncoats and whatever that keep people pumped into this system. All right. And, it's full of people around DC, around the Washington comedy scene, because apparently, 10, 15 years ago, that's where everyone was recruiting from, etc. So what do you do with that? Well, somebody asked me, what about Jacobin's poll? Jacobin had a poll with YouGov, and YouGov does some decent polling, but the Jacobin poll used categories that were kind of self-reflective of Jacobin's own agenda. So its validity is hard to gauge. The problem is, it's not just alt media. People are talking about alt media is all just commentary. All media is all just commentary.
Right.
Okay. People come to me. I've been called a journalist, which I don't think I am. I just interview people because of the stuff I cover on Peru. And that's just me getting on Skype. I don't have the money to go verify any of this. And by the way, you're a big journalist on Substack don't anymore either, which is why they're focusing on bullshit on Twitter, right? Because it's cheap.
Well, it's also, I was talking to, and I know he's liberal and whatnot, but I interviewed recently for Parallax Views, Brian Karem, who was the White House correspondent for Playboy, and he sort of became known for going after Trump a lot during Trump's presidency. He would keep asking questions and hounding him to the point where Sebastian Gorka called him a punk. Not a journalist, not a leftist or anything like that. But it was funny because he was telling me, he was telling me recently that journalists say to him, "Well, how do I become a columnist? How do I become a columnist?" It seems like everyone's dream when they go into journalism now is, I want to be a columnist. I want to write op-eds. And I think it's become a problem because not everyone can, nor should everyone be a columnist or an op-ed writer, especially when they don't necessarily have a lot of experience in journalism to begin with. And they can gain that experience, but it's become an issue. And I don't even think, I think there's this problem where you have people that can't even tell the difference anymore between a viewpoint section and a news section. And I think media literacy has really gone down the tubes in a lot of ways.
Well, no, it definitely has. And as a person who used to teach media literacy explicitly to high school students and get thanked actually by both liberal and conservative parents. All right. I would even tell people there's a lot more to media literacy than most people know. Like, for example, how a picture is facing. So if someone's facing this direction in a picture, they're being portrayed as hostile. Go look at MSNBC and Fox News, but this direction for those who listen to this, if you're facing to your left, go look at the way that is consistently portrayed. Like, even the photography is designed to trigger implicit bias. All right, at that level. Now that's on the paper version of the news, the reading news, which by the way, every stat supports that, like, the vast majority of conservatives don't even deal with that. They go directly to television news. There's a completely, there's an audio gap between the forms of journalism that people partake in. This began probably back in the Jon Stewart days, right? Where like liberals were watching really smug satire that we all now hate, and conservatives were watching Fox News. Well, now this has gotten even more extreme. Our back in the 90s, it was mainstream news versus AM radio. So that's where we are. But
long pause there.
No, that's where we are. So what do you make of that, JG?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that I'm trying to find words for where I think we're at, but I keep wanting to not go back to like we're all doomed, but this is like my gut reaction to everything right now. I think that there's just an issue where the most sort of bile, quote unquote, takes. I hate that word takes. Everything's a take now. Are the ones that are getting the most engagement. And you see it sort of reflected everywhere in news media now. And I don't really know what you do about it. I mean, I've gotten to the point where I sort of, read my, choice of papers. I read stuff like Foreign Policy because a lot of my shows are centered around that. And, I read a few alt media sources, but, it's really become difficult to go through a lot of what people want to talk about, as in, I have listeners of my show that want me to talk about the latest, whatever the latest alt media beef is, or whatever the latest, talking point is on MSNBC or Fox News. And I increasingly find that I can't do it. And I know you're sort of in a similar position where you don't want to, be catering to the, like, I don't even want to say lowest common denominator. It's not even that. It's just, you don't want to have to cater to the sort of whims of the algorithm.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, to do that, I have to A, not do this as my primary job, and B, not care if I make a lot of money. And if you see people carried to the rims of the algorithm rewards superficial takes, at least for a while. I literally saw someone, I mean, I work for someone, we both work for someone who kind of rode their initial wave of fame, not from the 10, 15 years they did in alt media beforehand, not from the 3 years of like formal media they did for a publisher, but from Jordan Peterson. You know, that, I mean,
says it all.
and it got their clicks engagement. And the thing is, a lot of those people, it's a strategy though that doesn't pay off in the long run, because if you ever have to move formats, like I've moved formats like 5 times, right? But if you ever have to move formats, your numbers don't follow you when you do that. And you're often trying to chase a dragon where you can't find the next hip thing to ride up like that. Well, we talk about this as the rat beef model of a problem. The other issue is that if you need popular guests, also you have to kind of kiss a lot of ass. And I don't, when I say popular, I don't mean knowledgeable or good. I mean whoever's going to get the most clicks at any given moment. And I actively resist that as an interviewer. Like, if I know what someone's going to do in an interview, why do I want to be the 18th person to give someone that? But a lot of people, that's their bread and butter, and you can't blame them if it's their job.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think the other thing is, I mean, for me, the bigger issue, even than like the sort of media ecosystem we find ourselves in, and I probably focus too much on that media aspect because that's what I was, trained in university. So, but for me, the biggest problem we face is I feel like everyone's afflicted by this sort of like goldfish memory type syndrome, where we forget whatever happened 10 seconds ago. And, I know that's a common refrain. People talk about that a lot. But when I look at these things like, the issues surrounding Trumpism, right? I look at that and I'm like, well, this has been with us for a long time. I mean, what do you think Ross Perot was? It's just that a lot of stuff got put on hold, I think, right after 9/11. I think the culture wars sort of got put on hold for a very, very brief period in time.
And I think and the other thing is, a lot of the patterns we see right now, believe it or not, are just extenuations of patterns that we've seen in the American voter public going back to the 50s. Literally, for example.
Well, and also, I was just going to say, and I think my weird theory on like American politics is that a lot of it is just like you have, I mean, there's various terms used to describe it, but you have like an ongoing sort of friction and war between the sort of, I guess some people would say labor intensive capital versus like, financialized capital. I mean,
that's somewhat misleading, actually.
Okay.
It's more like productive capital because none of it's labor intensive anymore.
Okay.
Like, except for like mining, I guess, like pure extraction that's still heavily labor intensive.
Well, a lot of it's like these sort of, it's like the small business owners versus the big ones. So I think I'm not putting it very well, and I'm probably not putting it in good Marxist terms, but I think you see where I'm going at least.
Yeah, I do see what you're going. Well, I wouldn't say,
and it seems like we're always trilling whatever trends are being set from above.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain degree. I mean, like, what's interesting is like there are good outlets out there, depending on what you. But even those you have to read through a bias. Someone's mentioning naked capitalism. It's great, but you have to read it through the bias that they're heavily influenced by post-Keynesian and MMT. It's not the only form of left economics. Antiwar.com is great, but that's heavily influenced by right-wing versions of anti-imperialism. Some left-wingers right there, though. I mean, but they tend to be...
Snyder, he's a good left-wing author there. I mean, what's antiwar.com is interesting because I always tell people, I'm like, you could read an antiwar.com without even being an anti-war person, particularly the news section. But again, people don't realize there's a difference between the news section and the viewpoints section. You know, I mean, the news section there, David Camp and Jason Ditz run that. it's there's not really like a biased tilt in that news section. They're just reporting the, the cold hard facts of what's happening. And they're going off all the all the reports that are likewise doing the same. It's not like an opinion heavy thing, but I think people have trouble looking at that. It's very difficult for people to tell the difference between op-eds and the rest now.
That's what I'm finding. I mean, I was worried 10 years ago when people were telling me that an assertion was an argument, which was kind of funny. I mean, and that seems like a very technical and petty, pedantic thing to care about. But an assertion doesn't have any reasoning. It's just a statement. And an argument is not the same thing as evidence either. An argument is evidence, but it is not the same thing as factual evidence. It is just an elaboration of logic. And so if you can't tell those distinctions, you look at something and you're not paying attention to what you're reading, of course, you're going to run with things that confirm your biases. Also, when you even mentioned this today, I try to get away from being super technical on my Marxist terminology on episodes that we're not talking about that, because if you don't know specifically what the terminology means, and I've had people who even do know tell me that sometimes the terminology on some of these more technical episodes can be overwhelming, because it doesn't always mean the same thing as the common notion of what's being discussed. So, like, if I talk about labor-intensive capital versus productive capital versus socially necessary capital, et cetera, people are just going to, like, roll their eyes. So it's very interesting how you deal with this. But let's talk about something else, because there's a lot of shifts of money towards the Democrats up into the Biden administration, and that was reflected in media. So you saw a lot of media that was like considered all become more standard liberal media, The Intercept being one of the big ones. This division was, of course, exacerbated because the exacerbation of this division is good for pushing articles, because the meta commentary on media often gets a lot of views on Twitter, and that's who reads a lot of this stuff. But if we ask ourselves, for example, who owns a lot of this? We've seen some pretty big ownership changes that are going to affect coverage. For example, Politico, normally assumed to be a center-left joint, and the Hill being the center-right one, has been bought out by someone with center-right politics, and its reporting lately somewhat reflects that.
I was also going to say you also should mention. Well, I guess their politics have never been, to the left, but even now, Insider, which used to be, I guess they changed their name from Business Insider.
Yeah,
to Insider.
Business Insider was kind of leftist like 10 years ago, actually. But
yeah, they were. So Politico Europe, and Business Insider were all bought by the German mega publisher Axel Springer. And my understanding is that Axel Springer is a rather sort of right-wing outlet. So, I know they've owned a German tabloid and a few other newspapers and whatnot that really were pushing for the Trump presidency. So they were supporting the Trump campaign. And I think people are not noticing these changes in ownership nearly enough.
Oh, yeah. Plus, I mean, they're all sponsored by
I forgot to mention, there's also reports coming out that they're looking to buy Axios as well,
which I've also seen shift slightly more rightward in the last few months. The media is getting pretty hard on Biden, and should be. But let's also be honest for a couple of things. Like, the Democrats were never going to do well in the 2022 election, barring some really weird sets of events. There's only been 3 times since there's been polling in mass media, so since the beginning of the 20th century, where the president's party has done well in the midterm elections, and that's during the Great Depression and then right after 9/11. So even like World War I and World War II don't follow those patterns. So like, I don't know what people were expecting. Now, why that's the case is anyone's guess. One of the things that it fascinates me is like a lot of sociological research says whatever politics you decide on in your late 20s tends to be what you are for the rest of your life. Before that, people move ideologically all over the spectrum, but that's hard to reconcile with the studies that like there are just big shifts between elections. So what that indicates to me is like a whole lot of people aren't that politicized in the first place.
Why would they be?
I mean, you know, the argument that we both talked about privately is like when people say, well, people aren't voting for progressives, so they're not voting in their best interest. But when they vote for Democrats and even progressive Democrats, they don't get the promised reforms like ever. So how is it not in their best interest to vote? Or just what they probably do if they have less than a college education and make less than $55,000 a year, not vote at all. I mean, and what's
the college education thing is interesting too, because I don't know if it was you or someone else was telling me recently that now not even like a bachelor's degree is indicative that you're going to be voting, like Democrat or whatnot.
Yeah. Oh well, the liberal voting patterns are more predictable after graduate school. Yeah, I was talking to you about that. There's a Pew poll that moved the education threshold for who votes Democrats up to graduate school. So, college graduates do slightly, like BA holders do slightly still vote more Democratic than Republican, but it's not a very strong predictor. What's also interesting though is poverty is a good predictor of either voting Democratic or not voting, but it depends on the region you're in. So that's another weird predictor. So like for every so many dollars under 55,000 you make, you're more likely to vote Democratic if you vote, but you're also way less likely to vote. So what does that mean? And we are talking about, for the past 3 election cycles or so, since the end of Bush, every election has been portrayed as mortal, and frankly, the engagement in politics has increased compensatory to that. Now, what I find interesting though is we're just talking about the United States right now, but if we look at the world, we're finding similar dissatisfaction with government, not just in the U.S. You see it in Canada, you see it in Australia, you see it in France, you see it, and a lot of times the center of these countries is holding, but with vast disapproval rates, right? Like the Tories in the UK are likely to be, the UK is basically going to be a one-party state for the immediate future. Probably for like a decade. But nobody really likes the Tories. Like they don't poll well. People just don't vote for Labour. Particularly after the Scottish National Party has peeled off a lot of the Scottish Labour vote. Now, how does that work? Again, the Liberal Party in Canada polls okay, but not great. Trudeau has had a bunch of scandals that would have normally taken out a Liberal politician. And doesn't matter. It won't matter in this election either. Their opposition seems even more sclerotic. In the United States, it's we're predicting a massive decline in the Democratic representation in government, and a lot of people think that the Democrats are going to get crushed in 2024. But I point to you historically, what tends to happen is the wave of victory is taken as an overextension of the likelihood of the regime, and then inertia sets in, and the president is able to stay in power despite relative unpopularity. Now, with Biden, it's going to be hard to say because Biden is polling with negatives, even I think of depending on which poll you look at, even higher than Trump, depending. In fact, I think I read that something like 65% of Americans do not want either Trump or Biden, the two most likely nominees, as the nominees in 2024. And they're not, Rick DeSantis and whatnot also don't seem to be super popular either. So
yeah, and it's been interesting seeing all this in lieu of, well, I don't think it's been a rise of anything because I think it's always been in this country. But it seems like, I hear a lot of people, especially my liberal friends, talk about the scourge of conspiracy theories, right? I'm like, well, conspiracy theories aren't just for the right. It seems like, everyone who's politically involved at this point seems to have like some layer of very conspiratorial thinking. And I'm not saying conspiracies don't happen, but like, it's always either Russiagate on one end or, I guess the Republicans are, I've seen right-wingers scream that, Biden's controlled by the CCP. It seems like everyone's in the grip of a sort of conspiracy-based thinking, or not even just conspiracy, but like grand conspiracy narrative thinking, which is a very particular thing that I think can get very dangerous. I think that talking about single conspiracies are one thing. A grand conspiracy is usually where things get really extremely dicey, and usually, I think it's indicative of how powerless people feel. And I was thinking recently about, we had the meeting in Davos recently. The Davos agenda. And what's funny is there's so many people that will talk about Davos now as the Great Reset, and they get very into the sort of conspiracy language of things. What's interesting to me is, as I think Ryan Grimm pointed out on an episode of The Hill recently, you can talk about the conspiracy stuff, but Davos is just about its own PR. Before they had the Great Reset, they had the Great Transformation. It's really just a way for, a transnational capitalist class that has emerged over the decades to get together, brand themselves and make themselves feel like they're doing, what's right and good, and they're good people. And then they go and pat themselves on the back, and they, keep making profits for another year until they meet again. And they act like they're going to help everyone else again while still making profits. And, that all gets sort of crushed by all the sort of conspiracy, Ryan Grimm called it the conspiracy smoothies sort of talk around Davos. And it's interesting because the whole problem of Davos, I think, Samuel Huntington, of all people, Clash of Civilization, Samuel Huntington, I mean, he was pointing out that what was going to happen with the rise of what he called the Davos man was coming, I think he wrote about it in the 90s. And it's a problem where you have a transnational capitalist class that is, not really accountable to anyone anymore. And how do you regulate them? I'm reading a book now. It's actually called Davos Man by Peter S. Goodman, who's a journalist at the New York Times. And it's interesting because he's been asked, well, how do we fix this problem where we have, a sort of transnational capitalist class that you can't really regulate, or you can't really chain in any way or reel back? He did not have a good answer.
What's funny, this is a real divider in left theory for those of you who get past the economic left theory. So, for example, I was debating, I'm going to have this gentleman on, his name's Sam Kangaroo, Warren Mosler's explanation for inflation is that prices are rising due to an overheated economy and mostly greed, and that's because the government is not negotiating prices down, thus accepting the rise in prices, and allowing inflation to continue. And if they were to negotiate their goods down, it would be a bulwark against inflation. And I kind of laughed at this explanation. One, Stephanie Kelton, the other MNT, doesn't buy it. So people do not take this as the modern monetary theory explanation for current inflation. This is being debated in those circles right now. But two, the government is not going to be a large enough purchaser to do that on a global scale, and the United States government is not an autarky. So while, yes, certain capital flight and whatnot is overstated, the idea that there could not be, well, we're just going to sell stuff to China because we can recoup more profit that way, and thus even further devalue the dollar, is ludicrous. Like, it's just, that's not how capital works. It's transnational. And unfortunately, a lot of the reformist left, broadly speaking, be they liberals, Marxist monetary theorists, social democrats, do not seem to fully grasp the meaning of transnational capital.
Can I comment on something real quick?
Mm-hmm.
I saw that someone commented on the whole, the Davos thing by saying, like, lazy and dumb people talk about Davos, and before it was Davos, it was, people talked about the Bilderbergs and et cetera, et cetera. I do think there is a problem. I mean, now when you hear the word the Davos crowd or like Davos man, I mean, even though Huntington came up with the term, this is like a term that the right now uses, and they're using it as sort of code of anti-Semitic language. And it's really become hard to talk about a lot of issues now, because I think the right sort of, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but sort of hijacks a lot of the way the left talks about things. I mean, I know you remember in the late 90s, you had all the anti-globalization protests, the World Trade Organization protests. And now it seems like it's hard to even, argue about the effects of economic globalization. I guess we're past the point in the 90s where anything could be done about it, but it's hard to talk about just because I think now the right sort of has used these terms. I mean, they use the term globalism now, right? But I was curious as to what you thought about that.
Well, globalism is interesting because, the right's been picking up on that since the alternate globalization movement, the alt-globalization movement or the anti-globalization movement, right? And the reason why it moved from anti to altern or alt was actually the beginnings of this right. The thing is, the populist fear about international capital is old, and populism cuts in a variety of ways. The international capitalist conspiracy theories in the teens and 20s, which became, the basis for Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracies later, were also a mixture of left and right-wing populism. That's not new. So they can adopt our terminology. They also adopt a lot of, in fact, there are certain kinds of leftist strategies that actually work better for the right than they do the left. The Saul Al-Kalinsky community organizing method worked way better for the deliberately modeled on Leninist cadre cells. In fact, they were modeled on Leninist cadre cells in a way the Leninists themselves never actually did. Of the John Birch Society, they also used Al-Kalinsky. Reagan explicitly used that in the 70s to push his campaign. Phyllis Schlafly used it. And that's kind of because it's easier for them to do. Community interests tend to be tied up in the property values and fears for raising your kids and whatnot. Whereas like union interests tend to be different, and how you get the same people. All right, the same people can go to either one of those functions, and how they would feel in regards to left and right in the larger society is going to be dependent on what they're doing in that section and their immediate interest. And so community organizing has a somewhat limited application, at least in its Al-Kalinsky design, for the left in that regard. So there's definitely that. The other thing that the left has had the right has had, the left has never been able to use, is already existing public institutions. And there's a pretty good reason for that. Is like already existing public institutions are going to be class collaborative and biased towards the status quo. Like if you're a church, you don't want to just be funded off workers because you need money. Now you also need butts in the seats. You don't want to alienate workers entirely either. But like, so you have this. Now, what's interesting now, and I think the left is still not grok this. They're like, okay, we gotta repeat the conservative focus on religion and go into liberal religion, but all religion is declining. We are living in a formally speaking secularized society. Now, whether that does not translate to people being more rational or being more scientific or any of that. That's not what I mean by that. So when people think that's what I'm saying, they're just misunderstanding me. What I am saying is coherent religious ideologies and institutions that go along with that have been declining because, frankly, people do not have the leisure, capital, and time to invest in them. All right? And in so much that they do, they would probably rather watch porn.
Can you blame them?
No, I can't. I mean, you know, like our play video games. Like this is the one thing that I think J.D. Vance was actually right about in Hillbilly Elegy. Like a lot of the people who claim to be values voters don't go to church, even though they claim to go to church, and don't really engage in public civic functions. They're more likely to be divorced, and they're probably porn addicted, and you know, because they frankly have more time. If you look at the leisure time of classes, of classes as defined by income, right? The upper strata of workers and professionals work more than the lower strata now. And who can blame them? Now, do they work harder? No, they do not. But the value placed on leisure time is different. The value placed on leisure time for those who have grueling jobs has increased. The value placed on leisure time for those who don't has decreased. There's several studies that show this. All right. Leftists that doesn't compute with the leftist brain because, like, we think workers must be doing more because we have to exploit. And I'm like, yeah, but it takes a lot. Socially necessary labor has technology decreases the amount of socially necessary labor needed in a society. We need less stuff done. All right. There is a reason why there's been a proliferation of like administrative jobs because we have built systems that require them actually, but we don't need them for production. And in everything you see, the actual amount of both capital and labor going into any given system has declined. All right. Now, I think that's consistent with labor theory of value. If you like understand how machines work and what socially necessary labor is, but if you have a very vulgar form of that, you can't explain anything about what's going on right now. So, you know, the same people who have who not value leisure time, a lot of the stuff that they would have formerly devoted to arts is now being devoted to stuff like following the fucking news, are spinning their wheels doing additional work or activism, or trying to get their kids into a better college or whatever. And again, unfortunately, the left has ceded most of this analysis to the national conservatives who have this is an interesting debate right now because, for example, in Utah, there's literally legislature that says we can't talk crap about meritocracy, but the people writing the best books against meritocracy now are no longer leftist. They're national conservatives. They're like Deneen types. For those of you who don't know, Patrick Deneen, the Catholic, I would say reactionary author who wrote The End of Liberalism, who, if you just superficially read it, like it sounds like the stuff I say.
Yeah, and that's I was going to say that's one thing I think people are missing right now is the sort of intelligentsia of the right is much more in flux than people realize. And I think there's an ongoing sort of conflict over who's going to, determine the future of what the right wing looks like. And yeah, I would say the whole national conservatism thing, I think in a lot of ways people aren't paying enough attention to where these people are going, because I think eventually they're going to have much more, I don't want to say power even, because I don't know, but you have younger sort of Ivy League educated characters of the right popping up now, even in places like National Review, people like Nate Hochman, who very explicitly describe themselves as counter-revolutionary. And, I think they are starting to make their way around in the system, because, the sort of old guard isn't going to be around forever, which kind of, I think people should be aware of that, what's coming down the pike. And the National Conservatives, where do you see them as getting their influence? Because my understanding is sort of they're influenced by sort of a Teddy Roosevelt style, sort of what some people call progressive nationalism. But I think it's
if it's Michael Lind, that's what it is. If people go back and read the American Interest magazine from about 2016, they did this debate on the 3 types of corporatism. Now, corporatism, for those of you who don't know, is usually a quasi-fascist tail word. And people who know me know I don't throw, like, the left throws the word fascist around far, far, far too much, to the point it doesn't have any sting anymore. But, like, for example, there used to be all these dumb quotes about Mussolini, the corporate government, like, the government of corporations is fascism. I remember this all the time 20 years ago on like proto memes. We didn't call them memes yet, but like stuff you'd see on like LiveJournal. And for those who don't know my age, because I look younger than I am, LiveJournal was proto blogging. Let's really think about that for a second. What does that meant? Well, corporatism meant the corporation of the nation into a class. Like, because Mussolini, for example, talk about proletarian nations, and the corporate nation was all classes incorporated together. Catholic distributists, which are not fascists but can be reactionaries. Some people think they're socialists. They're not. They're not socialist in the way Marxists mean socialist. Believe that the classes exist and should be in harmony. And that harmony is based on the corporate interest of all classes in a nation state. All right. And that, like, the aristocrats should be working with the bourgeois, should be working with the workers, and everyone has their proper place, and everyone should take care of everybody else as God intended. Now, Marxists think this is nonsense and literally impossible, that, like, the functions of one class is literally antagonistic to the other, and there's no way for that not to happen. But that's what corporatism means. Now, you have they were influential on the progressive movement in the United States, by the way. Like, there was a dialogue. All the stuff in Europe was in dialogue with that. Also, at the time, the Anti-Imperialist League, if you go look, for example, on articles, I'm going to do an explainer on the Anti-Imperialist League in America very soon. But the Anti-Imperialist League in America, if you see who studies it, there's a group of leftists who study it. And then there's a group of the Mises Society that study it, because that's also who it became. Like, the Anti-Imperialist League split kind of into the left anti-imperialist and the right anti-war libertarians, kind of like classical liberalism split into like 85 different forms. Whenever libertarians say they're classical liberals, that doesn't really mean anything, because, like, there are like anarcho-communists who were technically classical liberals. We have to look at this, like, historically, and what we see now is that these corporatists take a lot of move from Europe, and they want to combine it with Rooseveltian conservatism sometimes. But that's why there's, like, been debates between, like, Bronze Age pervert, who, was in these national conservative circles until literally a terrorist attack a couple weeks ago, and like some of these more Israel-friendly national conservatives, for example. So their influences range from the far right integralists, particularly the varieties of far right that are not explicitly racialist, but nationalist. So they're okay with national chauvinism, but not okay with like biological racialism. So anyone who integrates into the nation is part of the organic corporate whole. So when you hear some of these national conservatives will also go by the name integralist. All right. And an integralist is a non-racialist nationalist generally. So whether or not you want to say they're racist, they probably are, but they're not racialist in that they don't believe the racial distinctions are biological. They believe they're cultural. And that if you subsume yourself into the nation, like you melt into it, you can be part of that.
They're calling for everyone to assimilate.
Mm-hmm. Huh? Yeah. Yeah. Someone's saying classical liberal equals conservative. Classical liberal equals conservative, liberal, and some forms of leftism, because the American tradition is bourgeois. We don't have a blood and soil monarchist tradition. Even our anti-liberal traditions have to make peonage to, or some kind of at least semi-democratic overture, which is why, for example, you will see attacks on democracy in the United States, be they from the Confederacy or whatever, or even from liberals who will also frankly attack democracy when it's convenient for them in the name of democracy, but they have to do it in the name of democracy. Like, you can't do it. You can't make an argument for either like blood and soil monarchic nationalism, or really even technocracy explicit in America, right? You have to like couch it in quasi-democratic terms. What do you think about that, JG?
Yeah, I would say that's all, sort of how I look at it. With these figures like Deneen, it was interesting to see Rod Dreher recently, right? A piece on Deneen. And I know everyone hates Rod Dreher, the Exorcist guy from, those Chapo skits. But Dreher's always interested me because I think, and you may disagree with me, but I think he talks more in good faith, even if I'm, horribly unaligned with his views. Although, if he wants to go live in a little commune with other Catholics.
Yeah, if he wants to go live in a bunch of Orthodox Christians out in the middle of nowhere, I don't really care.
Yeah, that's how I've always felt about it. But it's interesting because he was trying to get Deneen and his supporters to admit to what their game is. Is ultimately what Dreher has been saying is, you guys are Caesarists. And also, if you think you're going to institute like Christian law in a country where there are so many people that aren't even practicing Christians or very secularized, you're going to actually end up hurting the very Christians you claim to support. And it was interesting because I thought about it for a bit, and I was like, he makes a very valid point there. Like, I'm not sure that the dreams that people like Deneen have or his followers have, I'm not sure that those are even realizable. I mean, Dreher went as far as to say, you guys should admit that you're Caesarists and that you're nothing more than LARPers. I mean, he went that far. And
I mean, yeah. So just so people know, leftists on Twitter are not the only people who LARP, or what I like to call MMORPG politics. Because let's be honest, they're not even LARPing most of the time. They're more just, putting their anime avatars and their Stalin emojis on their Twitter account.
Well,
but it's very similar. It's a very similar dynamic, but they have more money. Although, and I can't state this enough, the lack of money on the left is definitively overstated. It's not actually true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just gonna say with I guess what I was trying to get at with Deneen and a lot of this stuff is, a lot of people are larpers, and a lot of people just, I think, have bought into delusions, and I think that's happening at all levels and all kinds of different um, segments. It's happening to all different kinds of segments of the population. I don't think it's just elements of the right. I don't think it's just elements of the left. I mentioned Davos earlier. I was just reading a piece in the World Economic Forum where they were interviewing Michio Kaku, and I don't really care much for Kaku, and I think he should stay in his lane more. But he was going on about how through technology, physics will bring us the perfect capitalism. To which I don't know how to respond to that, because I don't even know what that means. The physics will bring the perfect capitalism.
Is perfect like equilibrium? Because to reach true market equilibrium, you must abolish time, and I'm not even joking.
Well, he went on to talk about how we're all going to have like glasses with implants in them, so we can see all the prices of everything, and we'll have perfect knowledge. So we can never get ripped off, and all this other stuff. And I'm thinking to myself,
yeah, that'll totally work in our healthcare sector, where you can't get a price pre facto, like legally even.
Well, I'm not even sure that I'm not even sure that we're capable of using all that kind of the amount of energy that's going to take, and a lot of other I'm not even sure it's physically possible what he's talking about.
Yeah, but he's of the class of people that probably thinks that the average American makes over 6 figures a year,
but
as opposed to $45,000.
What's fascinating to me about Kaku saying that, and people at the World Economic Forum apparently, well, I don't know, maybe they don't take it seriously. Maybe this is again just, oh well, this makes us seem like we care about the world. We're moving towards the perfect capitalism. But just it feels like elites, non-elites. It seems like everyone is getting caught up in these fever dreams, delusions. My friend Mike Swanson, who wrote a really good book called The War State, and more recently, Why the Vietnam War. He does a lot of great work on the military-industrial complex and its history. He also has done some very interesting work outing right-wing elements in Virginia and how they operate. And I would love for you to talk to him at some point. We'll have to make that happen. But
yeah,
it was interesting. He said to me when I mentioned the Michio Kaku interview, he said, as things get worse and worse, I think we're going to see more and more people go into delusional thinking. And it won't just be QAnon.
No.
And I think he's right. I think,
I thought the singularity stuff. I mean, I think we've been going into
Mm-hmm.
delusional thinking since the middle of the aughts. Like, go back and look at internet trends for singularity, and then like negative.
You're talking about like the Kurzweil type stuff, right?
The Kurzweil versus what's his face, the guy who like, not Nick Lamb, but the more respectable guy who posited an evil robot future. Plus the peak oil people. Yeah, Bostrom, right. I remember talking about Bostrom 10 years ago. And it was like Steven Pinker versus Nicholas Taleb versus Bostrom versus whoever, versus Kurzweil, right? Like, and these were all delusional thinking. This is all, I mean, the interesting thing about Taleb is he's the only person who really pointed, and I say this, he's kind of a reactionary.
Well, Taleb's weird because he often gets things right, which kind of bothers me as someone who, disagrees with him overall, probably on his, general worldview.
Right. I mean, he has he's often correct that endogenous shocks come, aggregates screwed up by, and I'm going to call them endogenous shocks. They seem external, but they're not. All right. We just don't know what the long tail predictability is. So, for example, I don't know, a pandemic happening every 100 years, even though they've actually happened every 100 years. By the way, 1820, 1920, 2020. Go look up what happened in those years. And so this is what you see, but that was 10 years ago. It's only going to get worse. There's study after study saying that, like, the more you see the effects of climate change, the less people actually believe in it. Now, I don't say this as a person who doesn't have faith in people. I do. But this is a coping mechanism when confronting with, like, is this not just cognitive dissonance? This is cognitive dissonance with mortal stakes for more than an individual person. So the cost of being wrong is not something most people can easily admit. And I think And you've been implying this. I'm going to say it. It drives a lot of left fads too. Like, how realistic was the DSA strategy ever? Now, when I say that now, people are like, yes, Varn, correct. Woo, you were always. When I said that even 2 years ago, and I did say it, I got tons of pushback. All right. The conditions have changed, but not a lot. They've just been accelerated by the pandemic.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's interesting too, because talking about delusional thinking, I think a lot of you know me, a lot of my focus with Parallax Views at this point has become essentially a lot of foreign policy discussion and geopolitics, and I think there's a lot of delusional thinking in foreign policy. I was talking to Katrina Vanden Heuvel of the Nation today, and she's interesting. I know she works at the Nation. Not everyone's a fan, but it was interesting because we were talking about figures like Zbigniew Brzezinski of the Grand Chessboard fame, and even figures like George Kennan in these Cold Warriors, Paul Nitze. It's weird because it feels like a lot of those type of thinkers in foreign policy are not around anymore. Like even a George Kennan was a realist. That's kind of gone way out of favor. The sort of Stephen Waltz and John Mersheimers are not on the inside anymore. And then on the other end of that, I think even like the Brzezinskis are gone, right? I mean, Brzezinski was like, the Cold Warrior of all Cold Warriors, probably the most mentioned or most talked about sort of Cold War U.S. foreign policy figure other than Kissinger. And it's always fascinated me. He wrote a piece shortly before he passed away. I think it was maybe a year or so before he passed away, called "Towards a Global Realignment." And he was saying it's over. The era of U.S. Global hegemony is going to end. Now, I'm not sure that that's happened, but I think we are moving towards a very different world. And I think a lot of people, especially in the foreign policy world, don't want to grapple with that. I think even the foreign policy world itself, the think tanks, and the people involved in the, I guess you would call it the military, industrial, congressional think tank complex, they're in the grip of sort of idealistic thinking as well. And the ones who sort of have backed off on things, people don't really listen to them. I mean, even someone like, people make fun of Francis Fukuyama a lot, but Fukuyama was one of the first, people to say, hey, I was wrong about the end of history thing. I mean, people forget he did that pretty early on, and he turned on, the whole Bush agenda.
He turned on it by 2004.
Yeah. But I feel like we don't have people like that are critically self-reassessing. Like, as much as I may dislike a Brzezinski, I think he was willing to reassess a lot of his beliefs and say, hey, maybe I was wrong about this. I don't see that with the new sort of foreign policy types in DC. It seems like they just keep repeating what has been done before. They don't want to change course or reevaluate.
I would say that's somewhat true. That's also true of declining empires even before capitalism.
Right.
I do somewhat believe, and this is not a Marxist belief, but that in highly contentious societies with a lot of conflict, but also a lot of hoarding of resources. And by the way, by hoarding of resources, I mean wealth, not income. All right, like income is irrelevant to this in some ways. So we can talk about people who are wealth rich and access and privilege rich, but income moderate or even poor. But there is a real sense in which advantages convert to children weaken the children, and they believe more and more in the bullshit. You think about, I talked to Dr. Kuba about this more than once. We talk about how like JFK, for all of everything, believed in the Cold War a lot more than Eisenhower did. Actually believed in it. And I know I get pushback from conspiracy theorists, because even left-wing conspiracy theorists have decided that somehow the JFK assassination is important, and that he was really probably a secret communist or something. I'm exaggerating, but not by a lot. Which I also pointed out, ironically, mirrored the Bircher conspiracy. The JFK, the arch globalist, secretly converted to anti-globalism right before he was shot. It's a very convenient projection. I think, if JFK had lived, he probably would have neoliberalized even earlier than we had seen, because he was already heading in that direction. But that's just speculation. I don't know. But what we can say is, at least until the very end of his life, where there was a real policy division between him and the establishment on the Cold War, he seemed to be a Cold War true believer in a way that someone like Eisenhower really wasn't. What do you make of that, JG?
Yeah, I think there's truth to that. I don't know. It was interesting. I was talking to someone yesterday about Brzezinski and his legacy. And it was funny. One of the things they said was, Brzezinski is someone that realized later on that elites had listened to him too much, and he was trying to tell them not to. They had gone too much in the direction of believing everything he sort of had built all his life, and they weren't pivoting when necessary. And I thought that was an interesting point to make. And I find it interesting. I didn't know this until recently, but Brzezinski, along with Fukuyama, were very involved in mentoring Trita Parsi, who is the head of the Quincy Institute. He helped found it. And it's very interesting because I think Brzezinski was one of his thesis advisors for it. But when I asked Trita about, what's it like to be supported by someone like Brzezinski or a Fukuyama in a lot of your work, he said, even within the DC policy establishment, there are people within what's called the blob that are starting to realize, things are not what they were 10, 20 years ago. We may have to change course.
Well, I mean, Dr. Kuba over at This Is Revolution, friend of the show, who has the Polish last name that I should be able to pronounce and can't. But he says the same thing, that it's not holding even amongst some of the elites, but they don't stay in the system either. Like, they opt out, because they have a fucking brain. And that's one of the things that you're seeing is like, okay, I used to say that one of the problems with the far left is, we might have money, but it's hard to keep people on the far left who are actually competent, because eventually they're going to get inculcated into the system. That's not true anymore. All right. So what's happened to a lot of these people? Well, they're just afloat. There is a sense in which the bourgeois have gone AWOL. Like, we don't really bourgeois power in America is actually structural, and almost to the point, you can talk about bourgeois structures like the stock market, and you can talk about old money, and you could talk about nouveau riche billionaires who are on the top of Forbes, but most of them are new. And they're also in sectors with a high amount of state capital and rents. And we've talked about all this. Actual commodity production doesn't produce a lot of wealth anymore. That's totally consistent with some things that I believe, but are controversial even on the Marxist left. But all that aside, right? We don't really know who the bourgeois in our society who aren't like the 10 tech billionaires and Warren Buffett. We don't know who they are. And I think one of the reasons why people focus on the quote PMC, the professional managerial class, for those of you who don't know the term, something that I don't really believe exists. But I do believe that it describes a bunch of different things that kind of look like they're convenient. But the thing about them is they actually dominate, they being managers, professionals, bureaucrats, all right, who have different interests as subclasses, right? They actually are at each other's odds too. That's why I don't really believe in this unified PMC if everybody has a degree. That doesn't make any sense. But there is a sense in which they're the most visible focuses of power in most people's lives, and they're also self-isolating, but we know who they are. We know them. All right. They also work in very visible fields. And then we know the petit bourgeois. And by the petit bourgeois, I mean small business owners who we in America will often call working class. All right. Even though they own their own businesses, and some of them they are the bit, like if you looked at Trump's base, they're the base. They're the income base of Trump too. Who makes $100,000 or more in a red state? That's the largest group of people who voted for Donald Trump and the Republicans in 2020. Who are they? They're small businesses owners. They make slightly more than the average income owner as a family, but not a lot more. And their profits are going down. They're also people, though, you can see. And they're community leaders in these declining towns because all these professionals have moved out towards cities. All right. But neither one of these factions are the real source of power in the United States. Neither one of them.
So I guess that leaves us at where is the real source of power?
Yeah. Well, inertia, structural capital.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, here's the thing I want to tell people. Okay, and the other real source of power, let's be honest, JG, in our society, is the military. And it's the silent source of power.
I wanted to get into that with you because I think it is. And I think we see a lot of people that don't really want to question, that don't want to. Well,
all these Civil War narratives that like liberals and stuff will throw around assume that the military will just sit on its ass while the conservatives and liberals kill each other, or that the top brass are all far-rightists, which is nuts.
They're also the one institution that can't afford to play this culture war game, right?
And they're
the only institution left that has, overwhelming support on both sides. I mean, there's been slight decline, although I think people are being premature about that. I know a lot of people, especially some of these national conservative types, that are really pointing at this decline in faith in the military, and that's, I think, why you're seeing them attack. The military's become too woke. But I'm like, what are they going to do about it? I mean, do you think the military is going to sit by if you try to overthrow them?
No.
Yeah.
And also, they're not going to let populist, like conservative or radical, completely destabilize the dollar, because that's why they exist. What people have not gathered, okay, and I've been trying to point this out to people, why is everybody in the United States, even the progressives, willing to fund the military no matter what? Even when they're not expanding empire. Some people, and I think these people, they think they're Marxists. Some of them are Marxist, but they don't have an economic analysis of power. They have a very facile notion of anti-imperialism. Think it's because the military wants to go to war with China. Now, there might be individual commanders who want to go to war with China. I do not write that off. There are some people in power who do, but the vast majority of people know that bombing the heartland of production would destroy the entire world economy.
And you can even see that reflected in the CFR. I mean, I always reference, there was a piece a paper co-written by Philip Zelikow, famously of the 9/11 Commission. Mm-hmm. He wrote a paper, I think a few months ago at this point, that was saying, how do we, avoid war with China over Taiwan? We have to prevent this from happening because it's unfeasible and it will not end well. I mean, we should know that because there's been, I think, 18 war game simulations so far, and none of them have ended well. I mean, these war games dealt specifically with a U.S. Involvement war with China over Taiwan, and none of them ended well. But it's interesting because that paper came out from the CFR. Even people in the CFR know that a war with China is untenable. It's not going to work.
And also from China's side as well, there is a deliberate cutoff point of the escalation of rhetoric. If you read China Daily, you'll hear Xi and other key members of the Politburo talk about easing things down to mutual assistance and doing it like both sides have a structural incentive to increase tension to a point, but no incentive to push that tension to the point where it's actually unstable.
Yeah, I mean,
Like-
Mike Swanson, who again, I'll mention him again. Him and I were talking recently about this idea that he thinks that the mixed signals we're getting on China in some ways, and you see it with the Biden administration, are about signaling to China, hey, we don't want an actual Cold War, because an actual Cold War would mean, China and the U.S. blockading each other. That ain't good for business at this point, right? Just with the way the globalized economy is, it's just not going to be good for business. At the same time, both sides sort of want these tensions because we have a military-industrial complex that we need to feed, right? And the military-industrial complex, I would say it's even bigger than just a military-industrial complex now. I think it encompasses a lot of different sectors that are benefiting from that complex, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I suppose we have to really deal with this in a way that is clear, because I think people assume that ideological motivations drive these states more than they actually do. And the states have a reason to have even foreign, commoners to believe that they have ideological motivations, because that makes their propaganda really cheap. But we should be realist when we, like, even if we're diehard, socialist, communist, anti-imperialist, whatever, right? We should have a realist view of foreign policy between nation states, and basically between nation states.
If we can, let's talk about that, because I feel like the term realist, I feel like people don't understand what that means. I think people hear realist and they think, oh, that's what Henry Kissinger was. Like, that's the people who just want to bomb people, right? It's not really what realism is.
No, I mean, Brzezinski and Kissinger are both realists, and they're on opposing sides on a whole lot of questions.
Right. But I don't think people understand what realism is. And it really has to do with we live in an anarchic world system, where people vie for resources, nation states vie for resources, and nation states are going to put their own interests above other interests, other countries' interests, which I think is generally true. We sort of live in this system of nation states. And I would like to see us get out of that somehow. I think that would be interesting and probably beneficial to everyone. But that's the sort of world we live in. I don't think you need to be ideological to be a realist, which is another thing I think people miss.
Yeah, I think there's a whole lot going on there. I mean, I am ideological in that I have a set of commitments, right? But when I try to look at the world, either the economic world or the geopolitical world, which are intertwined, okay, we need to, you cannot look at them discretely, even though when we experience politics in modern society, we experience the economic and political as separate, but particularly when you're looking at the actions of nation states, you cannot do that. And there have been times in the past where war was economically viable for the competition for access to resources. We no longer live in that time. Proxy wars are somewhat viable. All right. Low kill wars are somewhat viable. Quasi Cold Wars. But I say quasi Cold War because no one's going to interrupt trade between the competing powers, right? You might have a real Cold War between the U.S. and Russia. You won't really have one between the U.S. and China. And there's going to be people, I think, who, and we could talk about this too, because people have misinterpreted Trump, the whole, going back to the left liberal conspiracy theories, right? About Trump being a Russian agent. Trump did a lot of stuff that accelerated the decline of relations between Putin and the U.S. But it's gonna eventually, there's going to be, and it's not probably going to come from one of these national conservative cranks, at least not obviously. People who push for normalizations with Russia. There are people who do that from the left. The Center for Stephen Cohen was tied to this, as was one of the people from the Nation, the Center for
Yeah,
East
Katrina.
West.
Yeah, I'm blanking on the name of that
Yeah.
institution, but I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
But that's a left-wing institution.
Yeah.
All right. And then there are right-wing groups, certain
Well,
factions of national
real
conservatives
quick,
who
I
want
mean,
better relations with Russia too.
you saw an attempt at it even by Obama, the
Right.
Russian reset, and there's very specific reasons why Obama and I think elements in DC would actually think of doing a new Russian reset, and it's very simple. I mean, if they're thinking in terms of competing with China, they probably want to woo Russia to their side. So I could see a complete change up in regards to U.S. Russia relations at some point. Now we're at a very, this is like we're
Also,
seeing
China-Russian
brinkmanship
relations are not as set in stone as people in the West.
That's
think.
true. Yeah.
The Sino
Well,
Soviet split is not
it's
that
like-
far in the back, but they also have
it's-
competition in the same region.
But that's even true with like it's like when people use that term, the axis of resistance in the Middle East, right?
Mhm.
Which refers to Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, and sometimes Hamas, right? But a lot of people take that term and it's sort of a like rhetorical configuration. It's not like an actual organization. And when I look at it, I think to myself something like, okay, so like if new negotiations happened between, say, Syria and Israel, and I'm not saying these are going to happen, but let's say somehow Syria got back the Golan Heights in negotiations with Israel. Do you really think that relationship with Iran is going to remain the way it is right now? I don't think so. I think a lot of these relationships are much more unstable than people actually give them credit for being.
Right. Well, one thing I would say, and people are talking about Taiwan too, about this relationship, there's been a move from the KMT, the Nationalists, the people that the PRC historically fought, to actually normalize relations and begin reintegration into China from Taiwan's side. They're just not in charge right now. Believe it or not, the Taiwanese left is more opposed to China than the Taiwanese right. So whether or not China takes it by force or it just slowly reintegrates due to economic cooperation, reintegration is almost inevitable. And the U.S. knows it too, which is why, its hemming and hawing there is limited. Similarly, for Ukraine, Western Ukraine is probably going to eventually integrate into, the EU Polish, which is historically where it would have been anyway. And Eastern Ukraine will probably integrate into Russia. And unfortunately, because we botched the ability and not accepted that this reality as a fact, or that Ukraine was like a weird state that barely made any sense in the first place, that it will probably be a lot worse in its instantiation than it could have been. But you also see tensions between things that don't have to do the United States and all kinds of stuff. Kazakhstan, for example, we talked about this off air. Kazakhstan is one where the working, yes, there are intelligence agencies from Russia, the United States, and China all swarming on Kazakhstan now. But the actual cause of that is the Belt and Road Initiative running flat into local politics. Yes, there's U.S. money and U.S. intelligence money all over Kazakhstan because everybody has money. It's a crucial oil producing nation. Everybody's got money in Kazakhstan. Both the past regime and the future one had U.S. oriented politics, and they're both highly, even more integrated and aimed towards the U.K. But those are, leftists don't know how to process where different factions they feel aligned to come in the contract without basically crying conspiracy. And then when they see the intelligence agents from all different areas swoon into the area, like they did in Syria, like they did in Iraq, they always do. All right. They interpret that as, well, it was all an op anyway. Wouldn't it be comforting if everything was an op? Wouldn't it be comforting if there was actually some bourgeois governmental power? Which, by the way, the focus on the CIA is wild to me because they're like that's not even a bourgeois power, but whatever. Wouldn't it be? I mean, it's a subsection of a bourgeois state, sure, but wouldn't it be comforting if that were true? But it's just probably not.
Well, American exceptionalism comes in different forms. I think we have various inverted forms of American exceptionalism, where we assume that other countries have absolutely no agency outside of, well, the U.S. does this, and that's how it affects this country, and they have no agency in anything. And I think it's a bizarre form of inverted American exceptionalism.
Right. Well, I mean, the other thing I would say, and I've been saying that, I've been saying that for a decade. But the other thing I would say is, like, our understanding, like when I say that the Eastern Ukraine would probably integrate Russia, it is not because they're Russian nationalists or are highly inclined to Russia. It's just that there's more cultural and trade ties in that direction than there is towards and also true with Poland. There's cultural and trade ties there. There's religious ties in both directions, and this politics stuff has had effect on religion. Like right now, the Russian Orthodox Church and the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople, so the ostensible quasi head, the first among equals of the bishops in the Orthodox Church, have split more or less, or in schism, because of Ukraine. So this has effects throughout the world. All right. Do Eastern Ukrainians want to be rabid Russian? I highly doubt it. But I also doubt that they're super integrated in with Western Ukraine either. And it's a small nation. All right. Small nations, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, are never at good geopolitical parity with larger ones. They're just not, unless they have a resource and they can protect it against a larger military. All right. Like, people need to look at that. People need to be, we talk about being materialist all the time, but they need to actually be materialist.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm just overall surprised by, well, not surprised, but the whole Ukraine-Russia NATO drama lately. I think in a lot of ways we should have seen a lot of this coming. And I mean, even before like 2014. One thing that I get from a lot of Russian scholars is that ultimately, a lot of things that were done in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union have maybe come back to bite us in the ass. I mean, I think there's a direct line between the fall of the USSR and then the rise of Putin. And, whether
I think that's undeniable.
Yeah, but a lot of people do deny it, right? I mean, a lot of people, it's interesting. You mentioned Stephen Cohen. I feel like Cohen, was just sort of pushed to the side in a lot of ways with a lot of the criticisms we have, or with a lot of the criticisms he had about how we talk about U.S. Russia relations, especially in the Trump years. I mean, and even something like how Russia feels about NATO. I mean, there are reasons that Russia feels the way it does about NATO, given past history. And I don't see any point in denying that, but there's a lot of people that do deny that, right? And it seems like I don't want to sound like one of these like hardcore Russia supporters, right? But there is an issue where, we don't look at how, there would be reasons that Russia would be against NATO expansion.
Here's the thing. Like, I think that I do not think that Russia is a particularly left-wing. In fact, I would say that it's a very right-wing nation now. But most of what it does in terms of geopolitics is totally rational. Like, it is not an irrational player, and it is not interested in a global hegemony. When we talk about like inter-imperialist wars, these are countries that are aiming for regional hegemony, probably because the idea of a world hegemony is based on a bunch of conditions that will probably never exist again. If we are talking about nation states, and if we're talking about something else, you're in the realm of something completely different than what we know now, right? Like, so, my ideal politics is not anything that exists in the world now, but that, like, when you ask me to analyze the world, I have to analyze it with what is as it is. I cannot project my hopes and fears onto that analysis. If I do, then I will be wrong. Now, it's impossible to not project some of your hopes and fears on it. Like, there's no way not to. Like, and I've been wrong plenty of times, and that's part of why. But, there you go. Anyway, We were going to talk about a lot of stuff. One thing I'd like to tell you, though, is we've seen the paleo conservatives' hostility to the mainstream of left-wing, of right-wing politics. This is a topic you and I have talked about off air that we should talk about now. That is probably ending. All right. Now, Trump kind of put the American conservative in a tailspin. I mean, people couldn't figure out how to orient towards him over there in a way that they had a clear orientation with Bush. But that's going to probably even be more true. You want to talk about why?
Yeah, well, I mean, just look at the shakeups that have happened at the American conservative, right? I mean, you know, a lot of people that were covering the foreign policy beat there, Kelly Vlahos, Daniel Larison, Barbara Boland, they're all gone. Really, like the last holdouts on the foreign policy section, I mean, Basevich is still there, right? But I mean, pretty much a lot of the people who were more interested in the foreign policy side of things are now out. And I think there's been changes in how the American conservatives run, who is involved with, you know, different organizations that fund it and things like that. I think there's even, and I'd have to, oh, here it is. Okay, so if you go to the About Us section of the American Conservative and you scroll down, you can actually find, well, now they've taken it off, so maybe it's changed. But, you know, the last time I was looking at it, there was, you know, Tucker Carlson had become involved with the American Conservative. Maybe that has changed in like the past month, which would surprise me. But I think it's worth noting because, you know, I think Carlson has sort of steered the ship in a lot of ways for where conservatism is heading. I don't know what you think of that.
He seems to be replaced. I don't think he's going to run for president because I actually think he thinks his power is actually parapolitical more than political. So people are like, "Oh, I'm worried about a Tucker Carlson run." Now I could be wrong about that. I don't feel certain about anything post Trump, as far as like where. But what I am seeing is Carlson is trying to make a new coalition on the right. He's trying to reintegrate the paleo conservatives, reintegrate parts of the neoconservatives under the guise of them, the ones that are willing to kiss the ring with the national conservatives, right?
I made a mistake, by the way. The reason I wasn't finding this on the About Us page was because I accidentally typed in Tucker with two U's, just because I'm, you know, a mess up like that. But yeah, he's one of the advisory board members at AmCon now, chairman, actually. So yeah, I think people have missed that. And that may explain a lot about AmCon.
Yeah, so I mean, we will see. I think what's going to happen is a lot of the dissident conservatives are going to be reintegrated into the conservative movement. I also think this is going to finish off the libertarians who have resisted. I mean, most of them have already fallen to national. You know, they're any opposition they had to the GOP anyway.
Well, what you really see happening with a lot of libertarians now is the this whole friction. A character by the name of Peter Quinones is one of the people at the center of it. There's this whole push by people like Quinones to call themselves post-libertarians. They say, oh, we need to break from the Libertarian Party, and also we should support the right because the left is just too bad. And basically people like Quinones, in my opinion, are just becoming, you know, Trumpist MAGA conservatives. And, you know, I think this was always getting to that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of movements in this realignment that aren't really about realigning the American public, although that's happening to some degree. It's also about realigning dissident factions back into whatever coalitions that they are. I mean, and let's be honest, the DSA has effectively done that with the emergence of the left as a dissident faction from liberals after the 90s and aughts has immediately corresponded with the reincorporation through the DSA. Right. I do not think that was intentional, but you know, by anybody in the DSA. But I think its effect is undeniable. Mm-hmm. And I think the unpopularity of progressives and the fact that the socialist factions seem to be aligned with the progressives does not play well for their future. that their reincorporation was at their own cost. Similarly, for a lot of these other groups, like I think any appeal that paleoconservatism had, like the Ron Paul movement or whatever, will be damaged. It was already damaged by Rand Paul in many ways. Its reincorporation into the larger whole of conservatism, like Rand Paul moved a little closer, et cetera, et cetera. The meanings of those dissonant factions are going to be thinner and thinner and thinner, and they will be reincorporated into things that aren't that different from the old neoconservative playbook. The other thing I would think is people don't really understand what neoconservative, neoliberal, and all that mean. I mean, neoliberal is not even thrown around by right-wingers. I am one of the rare people on the left who don't think we're actually still in the high point of neoliberalism, in so much that it still affects things. It's kind of in its decline as a habit that we have.
Yeah, it's really weird. I was having a conversation with a mutual of ours, and I was saying, neocons and neoliberal, that doesn't mean the same thing. And they were saying, well, Obama droned people, and I'm like, I don't understand what that has to do with anything. Neoliberalism refers to a sort of economic way of thinking. To me, neoconservatism is really primarily a very, I would say, foreign policy driven ideology. We could get more into that, but I mean, if you go back to like the origins of it, or someone like Irving Kristol, Bill Kristol's dad. I mean, Irving Kristol was fine with making peace. He wanted, in a lot of ways, I think, the right to make peace with the welfare state. He had other things he was concerned about, other than, a lot of this stuff isn't domestic with neocons as much as people think. And I think in a way they've broken apart.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, I think it's interesting because I think the neoconservatives have broken apart. A lot of them have reintegrated themselves back into the Democrats, which was before they were neoconservatives, where a lot of them came from. A lot of them have become institutional men, more willing to reconcile with the conservative party. Some became never Trumpers. That's increasingly less relevant. So what we will see is a reincorporation of different kinds of institutionalists. So we will see a lot of this. As for neoliberalism, people are asking why I don't think we're in a neoliberal period. I don't think we're totally out of it either. But if you actually look at what defined neoliberalism, which is the use of public-private partnerships for private gain based on real market functions where there could be losses, but sometimes buoyed up by the public, plus massive financialization. We still see the massive financialization, but you see less and less of the creation of public-private partnerships. In fact, what you more see is just outright public-private partnerships with a market relation where there is actually risk. What you increasingly see is stabilized rents, which is a different thing. It is not completely different from neoliberalism, but things like the fact that modern monetary policy has any claim to be descriptive and not normative, and that claim is thin, by the way, but is based off the fact that a lot of the policies that it sees as developing have actually been tried since the middle of neoliberalism. So the austerity parts of neoliberalism are going to come in different ways. However, what I suspect you'll see is stagflation will lead to people being willing to brace the shock anyway. All right. What that will mean after that is up to anyone's guess. But these are the things that begin and end most periodizations of capital. We cannot say what the current period is or what it's going to be any more than we could have called neoliberalism in 1968. There were other things that could have happened. They weren't likely, including the abject failure of profitability across the board. So, so there is a whole lot of this going on. There's I said at the beginning we should be careful about these terms, and I really think that because, for example, well, some people will say Reaganism and Thatcherism is the same as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is older than that. It was even begun under the Labour Party, and it was really accelerated and formalized under Thatcher, but it began the end of the Labour Party rule to try to suppress inflation in the UK, similar to how Carter began neoliberalization for the same reasons.
Yeah, and I mean, its origins go back further than that, even, right? I mean,
the Mount Pelerin Society and all that in the 50s and 60s. There's also, it's like some people that we call neoliberals, such as von Mises, were not. Von Mises separated
it is not.
From them.
Yeah, libertarian. I tried explaining this to someone recently, and I'm not very good at it. But the idea that libertarian and neoliberalism are interchangeable is a very bad idea.
Yeah, it is not. It is not the same thing. Ordoliberalism or old liberalism, old free market liberalism is not the same thing as neoliberalism. Old free market liberalism opposes public-private partnerships in regards to favoring purely private ones, and that is a different thing. And it's also not likely. Also, ordoliberalism is based on a view of capitalism that actually probably never existed because there's always been states ensuring markets. That is the cost of setting up a market. But yeah. So there's all these things to deal with, right? We're in very interesting times. Mention Carlson again. Go ahead.
I wanted to get back to, well, it's good that you were mentioning Carlson because you were talking about this sort of bringing the dissident elements of the right back into the GOP fold. What do you think is going to be the driving factor of that? I mean, for me, I think a lot of the things that are going to unify people on the right at this point, and I think we're already seeing it, is China is coming to get us, and we have to crush the skulls of the Chinese hordes, very xenophobic type stuff. But that's where I see everything sort of coming back together and the sort of right reassembling itself.
I kind of see that too. And what I also see happening is Carlson's aware of the conspiracy dynamics that we talked about. I've talked to you over and over again about this debate that I focus in on a lot between Turkel Carlson and Eric Alterman of Alternate in like 2005, 2006, when Carlson switched from being a neoconservative to opposing the Iraq War. And Carlson had mentioned the rampant spread of conspiracies in the very paranoid and deracinated Mubarak Egypt. All right. Well, now I have lived in Egypt, and I can tell you he's right about that, by the way. The conspiracy theories like Illuminati or whatever are often used for substitutes for whatever capital or geopolitical crisis is going on. Carlson's encouraging of conspiracy theories then must be viewed in that light, in so much that he really does know what he's doing. It is not like Alex Jones, who one might view as an honest grifter, in the sense that Alex Jones at least can convince himself of his own grifts. That is not the case with Tucker Carlson. There's no way around that. If you've done a debate, even 15 years ago, where you said, hey, a declining society is susceptible to mass conspiracy theories, which is the way to maintain power, and then you start pushing them on your show, 14 years later, one must do the line. But Carlson has become one of the best political actors in redefining what this right is, considering that Trump really didn't finish doing it. While there is an allegiance to Trump as a person, no one knows what Trumpism is the way they might know what Reaganism was. National conservatives are trying to fill in the gap. Bannon's tried to fill in the gap early on. There's a lot of things, but this is going to emerge pretty quickly. And I promise you, people who think it's going to be easily defeatable because it will be solely a white identity movement, they're wrong. It's not going to take that color. They know that that's a declining demographic too. They're not morons. And while they might be trying to pass anti-democratic measures in the interim, I doubt they'll do it in the long term. They're just trying to figure out how to pivot correctly. And if the left always sides with liberals who fail, we're going to make that easier for them. And some of these things are, a lot of the left discourse, like the pro and anti-vax stuff. Like I saw a colleague of mine, one that I don't even dislike, start talking about, well, why don't liberals want the pandemic to end? And I'm like, well, no one's politics chooses when the pandemic ends. Like, whether they want it to end or not is irrelevant. You have a spike right now, and there's so many issues that are like that, where the entire discourse makes people feel like they have power over things they do not, and that they know things they don't know. And they're not looking at the key players in this discourse very deeply. Instead, they're sucked into Twitter, and there are material reasons for that. I'm not even saying that to shame people, all right? But as an individual, you can train yourself to not do that.
Yeah, I'd agree 110% with that. And yeah, it's interesting with Carlson, because one thing that I find odd that gets left out of discussion of Tucker Carlson and his influence is how he often is able to pull from things that are not entirely wrong. So if I can explain that really quickly, in case anyone's like freaking out and thinking, is he saying Carlson's right? No. So like the whole Patriot Purge thing that he's been pushing with this like January 6th stuff, where he's trying to say it was, it was all an inside job, right? I don't think that. But it's funny because he pulls from Trevor Aronson, who's actually a really good journalist, to try to make a circumstantial case for that. Trevor Aronson wrote The Terror Factory, which is really good journalistic expose of how during the War on Terror years, there were all these entrapment cases happening. I mean, we were basically creating the terrorists. I mean, we were like, we had these federal agents that were like, well, maybe you should consider building a bomb, right? And, that really did happen. All these entrapment cases did happen, right? Because if there is no threat, then what's the point of these agencies? And Carlson has pulled from that and sort of made this case of, well, if they did it then, what if they're doing it to us great patriots now? Now, I don't think that's what's happening, but it's interesting that he's able to pull from things that the left were talking about maybe 10 years ago, and he can sort of twist it into another direction to say, see, look what they're doing to the 1/6 patriots. But
yeah, I think it's interesting. What I think is interesting is how far Carlson is willing to go, though. Like trying to reconcile, for example, Alex Jones further with the mainstream of the conservative movement seems like a liability, but he clearly is willing to do that. The other thing I would say, though, is increasingly, I think you're going to see the politicization, not even of traditional culture war issues, because frankly, the right is using the judiciary to finally win on those, even if it's not winning in public opinion. That seems to be irrelevant right now.
I kind of feel like everyone ignored the rise of like the, things that, back when the Ron Paul revolution stuff was happening, there was organizations cropping up like the 10th Amendment Center, the whole states' right movement. I think a lot of people missed how influential that was going to become.
Yeah, I think I think people do miss how much that mainstream politicians actually use all these marginal and modal. When I say modal, by the way, people, what I mean is non-mainstream politics that comes out of activists who may or may not have specific class interests, but modal in that it's not an obvious mainstream part of American culture, but they use it. I mean, they do use it as a testing ground. How much of like conventional liberalism was from modal movements in the 1960s de-radicalized? Well, the de-radicalization and incorporation and recuperation doesn't just happen to the left, right? It also happens to elements of the right. But I was going to speak on one more thing. Like, the culture war issues are going to get weirder and weirder. COVID proved that to me, even though I've been thinking it for a while. Like, I've been seeing, like, okay, some culture war issues at least made some sense out of, like, evangelical or Catholic concerns in the past. But increasingly, you're going to see things politicized that seem fucking arbitrary. But that actually is an interesting thing because it makes something to the average person that does not seem political to be an indoor to politicization, and its arbitrariness is part of the point. All right. And particularly if it's not coming out of some like mass populist movement, but is a talking point. And I think the politicization of vaccines, which even kind of messes with the right, because even Republicans, by the way, by and large, on margin support the vaccines. All right. There's poll after poll that indicates that. They are far more likely to distrust the vaccine, but it is a large minority, not the majority. But it's still the willingness to go there is now a tell regardless of where you are. Now, that does not mean that any vaccine skepticism or whatever is necessarily a sign of a reactionary. I don't want to say that. And some of the stuff they point out about masks are like the inconvenient messaging or the kind of batshittery at the CDC, etc. That's all real, by the way. I mean, like, this stuff wouldn't stick if there wasn't some truth to it. But the thing is, and the liberal defense on just defend science also becomes that's bad for us to double down on that as a partisan position, because it will discredit certain elements of science to semi-non-committeds who are beginning to lean in another way. Now, if your goal is to politicize the working class, you're politicizing people who are largely politically non-committed. All right. And your goal is not, my goal is not to make them all Democratic voters. All right. I got called out on this in a comment on this show a way back. My goal is not to make them all good Democrats. I actually kind of think the Democrats are a historically aberrant party, and I do not love that the historical tradition going back to the FDR has tied us to that mess, and that we have allowed during the course between 1930 and 1995 the state level politics to basically enshrine those two parties into law, because we have been asleep at the wheel on the state level. And that, by the way, is what enshrined them into law. It is not even their popularity. Yes, in a first past the post voting system, you have a tendency towards duopoly, but there would be viable minority, like very small third parties in the United States, if it was not also the case that for fear of the socialists, for fear of the populist, for fear of Roche Perot, for fear of the libertarians, for fear of the Greens, that laws have basically made access, institutional access, very hard for people to get, even if those same parties can get ballot access for the executive at a state level where it doesn't really matter. They can't build up any electoral base on a state level in a lot of places. And this is like written into state laws in certain ways, in a way it's not at the federal law, for things that are essentially private corporations, literally. We have to deal with that and be much more aggressive in fighting it, I think. And I don't mean by building a third party like the Greens again, or like the People's Party or whatever. I mean by like actively looking at what political organizations would emerge. And if you wanted to turn that into a party, how do you do that? You don't just start off trying to get a bunch of activists to proclaim a new ideology. That's not the way that labor parties were built in the past. They were built off of coalitions of unions. And in the U.S. in particular, Taft-Hartley and the Labor Relations Board Act and all that actually has made that effectively legally impossible. But in the past as well, those coalitions were illegal anyway. That's what you have to deal with, right? As far as like what we'd have to do to change this course politically, in electoral fashion. And I'm not sure we can do it in electoral fashion. And I'll just let you think on that for whatever you think that might mean. JG, do you have a closing point? I know I've talked a lot today.
I want to come back to the Jan 6 thing, if we can, really
Sure.
briefly. I found it interesting. Like, I know people are attracted to all this talk of, I mean, if they're attracted to the talk of it at all, because I think a lot of people are just like, who cares? Liberals are just fetishizing it. And I think there's a degree of truth to that, right? Like, I take January 6th seriously, but I also don't like the way a lot of people have talked about it. You know, I find the way liberals talk about a lot of things to be like weirdly like treating themselves like they're in some kind of protagonist syndrome laden fantasy novel. It's like we are fighting the forces of the battle between the forces of light and darkness, as if we're in Lord of the Rings. But that's beside the point. January 6th, I find it interesting. We jump on the whole the feds, and I mean, you have this whole issue of the DC Guard saying that the Pentagon is lying about their timeline. That people like General Charles Flynn were lying about their timeline of what happened, and you know, one of those two parties is lying. In a lot of ways, I think that's much more interesting than the question of federal involvement. It's weird because I feel like a lot of times, and maybe it's my own biases, but I feel like a lot of times people are missing stories that need to be told for stories that may be more sexy, you know, because, you know, oh, let's talk about the feds again. You know, everyone loves talking about that, and I can understand why, especially after you know, everything we saw with the war on terror. But you know, I think there's a lot of interesting questions that are going to arise out of January 6th. I thought it was interesting that Mark Meadows, before the January 6th incident happened, was saying that Trump should invoke national security or national emergency measures. And that sort of ties back to what you were talking about with, you know, the military being like the hidden power behind the PMC. I think it's interesting. I'm really into this issue. It doesn't get covered a lot because I think, you know, rightly or wrongly, people associate it with like Alex Jonesy type conspiracy theories from the 90s. But there's this whole thing known as continuity of government planning, which has a really interesting history going back to the 70s with Operation Garden Plot, and then later Rex 84, which Oliver North was questioned about famously by Congressman Jack Brooks. And, you know, Brooks was told, can't talk about that, national security. But what we know about Garden Plot and Rex 84 was that there were plans for continuity of government and rounding up dissidents and whatnot. I think the new version of that is U.S. Northcom. What is it called? Conplan 3502. And this all sounds like really like crazy heavy stuff, right? But you know, I think there is continuity of government planning for national emergencies. We're already in multiple national emergencies right now, and the one that was instituted after 9/11 gets, you know, reinstituted every year. It's you know, renewed, and it's interesting because I've said to people, you know, let's say continuity of government was put in place. I mean, what is either the left or the right going to do in that case? Is those plans are very much we know they exist. If there is like you know, civil disorder, the Conplan 3502 is entitled Civil Disturbance Operations, and then there's another one, Conplan 3501, which is basically based around defense support of civil authorities. People can look both of those up, but I always found it interesting that people think we're going to have a revolution, you know, either on the right or the left, when we already have a military that is planning for COG measures.
Yeah, I mean, clearly they're running training. This is the other thing is people think because
like, I'm sorry if I sounded like I was like putting that real slowly or like in an oblique way, but I don't want to sound like one of these people from the 90s that was like, you know, freaking out about FEMA camps that weren't really there. Do you know where I'm coming from?
Right. But yeah. There is a way in which, though, we have to be realistic. They are running war games, fighting insurgent local groups, actually clearly designed rightist in South Carolina 2 weeks ago. Like that's a real thing. 2 weeks ago, for those of you who are listening in the future, this would be the beginning of January, and it made the news without much affair. Like, that's not historically normal. My thing about this is a center of power. I joked to you, I called it Burnham's revenge, because people read the managerial elite and they don't remember who Burnham thought the real managerial elite in America were. And he thought they were like run politics explicitly like Eisenhower, but he was talking about the military general staff. That's who the managerial elite he was referring to actually were, the management of the military, the logistics people. And in a very real way, a lot of the left and a lot of the right now have just forgotten those people exist, or they think because of a lot of like normie soldiers involved in that might have right-wing tendencies or left-wing tendencies. In fact, you'll find both in the military more than you will even in the general public, I think. Although usually the left-wing tendencies is a result of being in the military, not going in. But what you will find, I am guessing, is that the brass knows that and is even talking to it. And they've leaked stuff about this too. Like, they want internal consistency and to make sure that if something happens on U.S. soil, that if the military acts, it will actually be respected by the soldiers. They're not stupid. But you cannot just pretend that the largest and most expensive military apparatus that has ever existed in the history of the goddamn world is just going to let us do whatever. And most of the analysis I see, even from serious people, even from the 538 wonks and whatnot, do not mention them entirely. So when people talk about a right-wing dictatorship, they always assume it's going to be some Trumpist or some populist or something like that. And I'm like, if they actually tried to do economically what they say they'd want to do, it would be politically destabilizing anyway. And what do you think would happen? And the military does not want to do that. I don't want people to think I think the military is likely to coup, because the military's power is based on being seen somehow as an apolitical actor. Which is why, for example, it said on its hand during the Trump administration, Trump had to use like backdoor DSS measures and stuff to get what it wanted in a way that, say, like Bush Sr. during the LA riots did not have to do. So I think all this stuff is stuff people should really think about. And I don't think most people are. And I don't say that to make people paranoid, because I don't think the military the military benefits from the status quo. But if we really think the status quo is going to end, even from the point of public legitimacy, what's the only institution in this country that most people trust? It's not the police. It's not any form of state or federal government. It's the military, because it's seen as a neutral arbitrator.
Yeah. I mean, that it's also interesting because I've thought about this before with regards to certain elements on the right, especially those elements that have, well, like the Mike Flynn's, the Michael, I always pronounce his last name wrong, Scheuer, I think, or Scheuer. It's interesting to me because all those figures were sort of on the inside of the system, right? And they're very right wing, and now they're calling for this like war against the deep state by the civilians. And I find it really interesting that they're advocating for that, because I can't imagine that they don't have an inkling that would end poorly. I also wonder if, like, a lot of the right, if they do want to gain power, I wonder how much of it is going to be driven by the thought that maybe they have to get more people into the sort of military brass, the higher command. And I could see that being a move the right makes in the future. I don't know if you agree with that. I don't even know if they could successfully do that. It seems like a lot of them have been pushed out at this point. Like people like, Flynn and whatnot, really. What is their influence?
What I find interesting is even the Trump appointees, the last minute Trump appointees that everybody, when the left was really worried about a military coup, putting in dictator Trump, which I thought was ridiculous. They were not super copacetic with some of the more wild stuff in that either, right? If you read what they had to say, that's not where their mind was going. Mateus was another one like that who pushed back on Trump, et cetera, and so forth. Mateus is a vaguely not neoconservative realist, and people needed to understand that. So it is something that I think people need to really look at in regards to the way everything is going.
Yeah. But what
So
I guess what I'm asking you is, and I'm sorry if I'm like stretching this out, but what do you think of these like various figures, whether it be like I mean, maybe they're just people that have lost their mind, but what do you think the game is for a lot of these people that would, it's funny, like Alex Jones has on these people like Anthony Schaefer, who was in the Defense Intelligence Agency, and all these other figures that would be, within the right sort of language these days called, deep state, right? But you have all these like people that were part of that that are now sort of pushing this line of needing to create, I think Flynn calls them digital soldiers. It seems like there's these weird right-wing elements that used to be in the military or the intelligence apparatus that want, to bring the war they saw with Vietnam or the war they saw with the Cold War. They want to bring it home because they think we've, gone too far left, right? What do you think their game is ultimately? Or do you think it's all sort of for show and theatrics?
I think it might not be for show and theatrics, but I think they're a minority even of the military. Sure. Like, and I don't think they have enough pull to pull off anything that they would like, even if the military may be annoyed by leftist shenanigans or BLM riots or whatever. That's not in their interest. It's not in the interest of their base. It's not. And so I don't think they really have anything, but it's a useful political career once you get out.
Yeah.
And that's what I think. That does not mean that those people aren't dangerous. Like the only thing I was listening to the 538 thing on Civil War, which I mentioned this twice today. The only thing that they said that I thought was interesting, which I also thought was like, but that's not a civil war though, was the mention of what civil war would really be an insurgency that can't win because it'll be based on like fifth generation warfare models, but it's against a state that is not occupying, but is the standing state of the country and it has some popular legitimacy against kind of against civilian actors, and it would devastate the economy. And then what they didn't say, but what I drew is like that would start bringing the military out if it was actually successful at that. It would not be like leftist and militias going out into the street and just shooting each other. It would be more like the days of lead in Italy,
right?
Not which could be very violent, but it would not be a civil war the way most people mean it. And it kind of annoys me that they use that language because they're invoking civil war the way most people mean it. But what they actually mean is a long-term destabilizing insurgency.
Right. Yeah, I would say that's about where I'm at on it. I think that a lot of like the sort of weirder ex-military figures that jumped on the Trump train are pretty serious in their thinking, but they've always been sort of angry, right? Like I think there's always been this element that has been angry about, we could have won Vietnam if we had just been allowed to do total war, but this State Department wouldn't let us, right? They didn't let us get the job done. And maybe this is just the like last gasp for them. And they're like, we will create an army of digital soldiers for QAnon. And maybe this is just the sort of pathetic final gasps of that sort of old guard of cold warriors.
Yeah. We'll see. I think what I think is we should be, what we know is the external pressures to the American political system that we haven't been talking about but we have been invoking are going to only increase. We're going to see larger regional blocks that are not under U.S. control. We already see that the empire already has done its Trajan's Wall move, which it did not like, was Afghanistan, but it's done now. Right, whether it likes it or not, it's done now. There's too many proxy wars for anything else. So we're going to see where this all goes now. Because not only has the old Cold Warriors been online, the old War on Terror people don't have the same pull either.
Mm-hmm.
So, there is a worry from both sides of the War on Terror at home, but there's also a worry that the basic economic interests are going to drive this to be weirder and weirder and harder to predict. This is where I get my Marxism plus Talib come in, like long tails, but also look at the basic economic underliers, right? The currency's destabilized. Nobody wants that. Nobody does. I mean, and I guess some MMTers will try to say it's not that big a deal, but most of them are even beginning to be really concerned about it because it's going to end their political project. That China's going to rise, but China has its own problems, many of which I haven't even heard the left really talk about seriously, like the fact that no matter what China does, it's going to be seriously hurt by climate change in its southern regions, which are super populated. You look at Shanghai and Guangzhou and Hong Kong, they're kind of in the bad zone for the future. And while China is taking climate change more seriously than the U.S. is, it is still also the world's #1 producer, just because it has to be per capita. I mean, it has to be per capita.
I was going to say I think the models they're using right now to predict what's going to happen with a lot of this climate change stuff. I think, and I've talked to Alfred McCoy about this. He's really good historian, right? But the models are seeming to show, and I mean, models are just models, right? They're not, you can't really predict the future. It's soothsaying, right? But, you can look at models and they're interesting and maybe they can tell us something. I think by 2050, the projection is that much of central Shanghai is going to be submerged due to climate change.
Right. And if there's a big ice shelf glacier in Antarctica that's likely to fall off in the next 10 years. It's going to raise ocean levels 1 to 2 feet. We've only seen 1 foot the entire 20th century. So what do you think 1 or 2 feet's going to do? It's a big damn deal. I think, and I also think, guys, you're going to see a lot of these dissident media figures who are dissident, are going to tail a lot of this as things get rougher. You're going to see a lot of people turn coat because they think that's where the money's going to be, or the support's going to be, or their way to get back into politics is going to be. But as all this is happening, climate change will march on. These pandemics are likely to happen.
The great migration of people is coming.
Yeah. There's going to be more and more stress on all these borders and all these populations. Also, most of the developed world is aging, and COVID took a lot of them out of work, if not out of the world. So if you don't think that's going to have an effect, you really aren't being a good materialist. And it doesn't mean that everything has to be so dire. I'm not saying that the world is doomed, but what I am saying is that the status quo is unmaintainable and something's going to fill the gaps, and we should stop projecting our hopes and dreams into that gap unless we start building the capacity.
It's so strange, isn't it? Because it's, as we were talking about the other day, I think a few years ago, everyone was pushing this line left and right, saying the center will not hold, right? I think even centrists were saying the center isn't holding anymore, and it's reassembled itself, right? It's reassembled itself quite well.
Although it's not really holding. I mean, this is what my
but that's what I was going to get at. Like, before you think I was promoting that line, it's weird because it's sort of come back, but it's not really. I mean, it's like two contradictory things are true at the same time in this case, because I don't think the status quo can hold. I think it's going to come apart.
Yeah. I think it might, but what's funny is I think maybe no one's in place to replace it before it does.
Yeah.
And and a lot of things that we think is counter status quo get reemerged into it. I mean, even Trump's, divergence from the status quo of Republicans is overstated.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is where we are. And I think if you want to have serious hope, and I do encourage people too, I'm not just a doomer, but to do that, you have to be honest about where you are, and you cannot lie to yourself about it. And what's happened is most people have. Someone's asking, will the next ballot be 12 trillion? When will it not work anymore? Who knows what'll work? I doubt. I mean, if in stagflation, you probably won't be able to do that. All right.
I was just going to say, I think the key to this conversation was, ultimately delusion is everywhere around us. And it's not just limited to the left or the right. It's, I mean, everyone is clinging to, false hopes and false dreams, right? I always think of that T.E. Lawrence line. I know he's not a very left-wing figure, but the line about, beware the dreamer of the day, because, he will make possible. I'm blanking out on the actual line, beware the dreamer of the day because he will work to make his dreams possible by night, that he dreams in the day, something along those lines. And I think we do have to think through and consider the potential and possibilities for what we're going to do going forward. We have to dream those possibilities and sort of work through them. And I don't really see anyone do that. I think we're just falling back and doubling down on a lot of things that, the time has already passed for them.
The angel of history fills us with LARPers. And on that note, anything you'd like to say in closing, JG? I've kept you for 2.5 hours. So,
listen to my podcast, Parallax Views, where I interview just about everyone and don't really. I'm increasingly not taking like a line necessarily like strictly ideological. I try to have people on from different, walks and viewpoints. I don't really care if they're liberal or conservative or left, although I have a lot of left-leaning people on. I almost treat it like an intel operation in some ways, like civilian intelligence, like just gathering intelligence from various sources and putting out the information. So that's where I'm going with Parallax Views. And
that's kind of what we're doing here too, as we're increasingly not. Yes, I am getting a lot of Marxists on to talk about history of Marxism, but increasingly, if you got something interesting to say, particularly about geopolitics or economics, I don't really care what your beliefs are as long as you can back them up. And I'm trying to find interesting people now, not the people you get on every other fucking podcast. You'll get some of those people because some of those people know me, but I just, there are 50,000 left podcasts right now, and 40,000 of them are exactly the same. And then the other like 9,000 of them are like downstream from that. So there's maybe like 1,000 of them that I'm overstating, but not by a lot, that are actually trying to do something different. And that's what we're trying to do here. JG is kind of my partner in crime in many ways. I mean, we literally had a podcast together way back in the day. Although it was about culture, not politics.
Although we ended up talking about politics a lot.
Yeah, I know.
We're going to have to do a revised episode on Matt Taibbi again.
Oh, yeah. I released that to my archives, and I was like, oh, that one didn't age well. That one did not age well. Oh, actually, there's a couple of figures where we were like, hey, we defended them. Oh, they did what we said they wouldn't do. Oh, well, shit. So don't let anyone tell you that I won't admit that we've been wrong, because we have definitely been wrong. So yeah, but yeah, check out Parallax Views. It's one of my favorite podcasts. You've done interviews with people, scholars of of the Nation of Islam, scholars of Mir Kahan and the Kahanist movement. You got a lot of people from Quincy. You get a lot of people who study actual geopolitics from a variety of perspectives. So you should check that out. I would also tell people
I have 2 shows coming up about General Smedley Butler and the business plot, which apparently now like mainstream authors are just itching to write books about that for years.
Finally,
it's so weird because I'm seeing all these like mainstream people talk about the business plot now, the Wall Street Putsch, and I'm like, wait, what? Like 10 years ago, if I brought this up, I was called a conspiracy. Now, oh, there wasn't much to the business plot. It wasn't, executed.
It was literally a Paleocon only talking point.
Yeah, and it was like, Smedley Butler was just senile. Now I see all these like people that are like mainstream people and historians writing about it, being like, yeah, it was all real.
Yeah, who knows what gets vindicated by
we
not.
We live in the weirdest timeline.
This is why you can't totally discount the conspiracy people, despite people thinking that's what I say. I think you just have to distrust grand conspiracies, because anything that requires more than 1,000 people to keep secret ain't going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the last great point. So check out Parallax Views. And similar shows, I kind of like Daniel Besner's show. You can also check out A New Conversation. You can check out anything on my former comrades at the Emancipation Network. You can check out This is Revolution, obviously. For those of you who wonder where I get my foreign policy guests, they're the people I know are there people that JG knows or Dr. Jean Bajelon knows. Like, those are the people where a lot of the more interesting academics and scholars and policy wonks come from. That's where they come from. Here are there people I know through like the China sphere and stuff like that. So we all bring it together. It's not really a podcast network. We're more just friends. But yeah, thank you for coming on, JG. Even though I talked as much as you, I probably talked more than you today. That happens when you come on, though, man. We're both
too
used
quiet.
to being
I need
hosts.
to be much more open and lively, I think.
Right. You're used to being a host. And when you come on my show for me to interview you, it's more like you interview me and then make some salient points. Like that's happened twice now, JG.
The third time's the charm.
Right. But you will definitely back in the future because we have similar concerns. We're both very concerned in geopolitics, and there's not many shows really doing that. Like I said, Danny Bell.
Why do you think that is?
It's hard to get experts, and you have to actually get experts. And so you either have to know people in those countries to get people on the ground, or you have to know scholars, and which means you need a well-connected PhD friend, or you need policy wonk friends, or you need to know people in the back end of the foreign policy media, right? Like the average leftist can't do that. Yeah, I mean there are some people at Jacobin or connected to Brill or whatever who can do it too. But in general, and most people get their foreign policy news from really weird sources, and I'm not going to name names, but they're all over the place ideologically. It's not even one place. So we have to be careful with that. But that's why I think it is. It's not as easy to do as to like get someone who's hawking a book. Right. I mean, and also if you want, and here's the thing, if you want good foreign policy stuff and you're dealing with people who write books, you're going to be dealing with stuff that happened 2 years ago. And so like, yeah, that's where you're at. So, the other people who do this, I think, what's Danny Besner's show? American Prestige. I think that's pretty good. I don't love everything. I don't always agree with Danny, but, and then, you guys should check out TIR, World Night Thursdays, when the whole crew's there, and then when Dr. what's her face is Dr. Maria, I can't remember her last name, I really should not, Rapapakova, that's probably wrong. Jean's gonna correct me later, but she has a show on a Wednesday once a month. You should also check that out. That usually has Dr. Kuba and Jean on it as well.
Can I make a podcast suggestion while we're
go ahead? Yeah,
I was gonna say for the with geopolitics, I would recommend, and they're not leftists who host it, but they're very good with geopolitics. They're associated with Quincy and stuff like that. But I would highly recommend Crashing the War Party, which is Kelly Vlahos, who's the editorial director, I believe editorial director at Responsible Statecraft. She hosts a lot of the panels that Quincy does, and she's helped me a lot in my journey with regards to looking at geopolitics and foreign policy. She hosts that with Daniel Larison, who is probably one of the best voices on the situation with Yemen, and they started their podcast about 6 months ago. It's very good, and they don't stick just to people they agree with. So they get a lot of people on from like everywhere from Quincy to like War on the Rocks to everywhere in between. And it's a very serious sort of effort on their part. So if you're interested in a lot of the foreign policy stuff I do, they do something very similar to what you and I are doing. So I would highly recommend Crashing the War Party with Daniel Larison and Kelly Vlahos.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is if you want some good geopolitics that's explicitly super left-wing, Red Star Over Asia is decent. And then in general, I would say look at, for understanding the China and Africa project, which I've had on before, the Seneca network of podcasts, which I've also had Kaiser Gua on. And I would look at, if you want like a foreign policy realist view that's a little bit conservative, even if you want to understand that perspective, Pekingology on Chinese Politics is by the CSIS. So there you go for some different foreign policy stuff. So Crashing the War Policy. So those are the kinds of podcasts I would suggest that you get into. What I would not suggest you get into is any producer of left celebrities. I would avoid that. All right. Okay, and that's all for now. We're gonna end you on a positive outro. For those of you next week sometime, or no, it's the week after. No, it's next week sometime. There should be another Diving Into the Wreckage. We're gonna talk about climate change this weekend, and on Monday it might be audio only, but it might also be released here. I'm recording it ahead of time. Anton Yeager is coming on to talk to me about the situation in the EU. So expect more. You guys know I'm trying to reschedule with my Honduras specialist, Karen, of Honduras now, and I'm working on it. As soon as she's out in an area of Honduras that doesn't really have consistent internet or electricity, and she's defending water, she's doing legal defense for water protectors. So she's fighting the good fight, and it's more important that she does that and talks to me. But as soon as we can get her on, we're going to do that. All right. With all that said, we are actually going to be done, and here we go.